In the silence of a winter canyon, where grief and snow lie heavy on the earth, one rancher keeps to his fire, and one wanderer seeks shelter from the storm. This is a tale of loss, of trust, and of love found where none was expected. The wind scraped across the canyon like a dull blade, carrying with it the fine hiss of snow and the sharp bite of winter. The Hale Ranch stood alone against the whitened earth, its roof hunched beneath a crown of ice. Wooden fences sagged under the weight of frost, their rails darkened with wet. Smoke lifted weakly from the chimney, whipped sideways by the wind before it could rise to the clouds. Inside, the cabin was a hollow of warmth carved into the cold. Jonah Hale sat near the hearth, boots planted on the worn planks, hands spread over the flames. The firelight etched his face in copper and shadow, catching on the gray that streaked his beard and the lines drawn deep around his eyes. His hands bore scars, puckered marks from rope, axe, and rifle, the history of a man who had built and buried more than most. He stared into the flames as if searching for something beyond them, but the fire offered nothing back but silence. The cabin was too quiet. It had been too quiet for years. Once there had been laughter echoing against these same walls, the light step of a woman moving between stove and chair, the gentle murmur of a child's voice asking for stories before bed. Now there was only the groan of the rocking chair as Jonah leaned into it, and the crackle of logs that gave no comfort. He drank his coffee black and bitter, for sweetness had long since left him. The night thickened outside, snow drifting like ash across the prairie. Jonah was readying himself for another stretch of silence when it came. A knock, sudden and sharp, rapping against the wooden door. His hand froze around the coffee tin. He had not heard a knock at this door in months, perhaps longer. Neighbors did not ride in during weather such as this, and strangers meant trouble more often than not. Slowly he stood, reaching instinctively for the rifle that leaned by the hearth. He lifted the bar from the door and pulled it open a cautious span. Wind and snow rushed in, scattering ash from the fire. There she stood, a young woman, her shawl clutched tight around her shoulders, braid wet and heavy against her chest. Her face was proud, though the cold had chiseled her lips blue and her breath came ragged. The storm haloed her in white, but her eyes burned dark and steady, unflinching as they met his. She spoke in accented English, her voice low and plain. "I can warm you tonight." The words struck Jonah like an ember carried on the wind, startling, unwanted, and yet alive. Suspicion rose in him at once. She was Apache, her features unmistakable. Old memories returned with the sight of her. Years of raids and reprisals, of burned wagons and blood in dust. He had fought, though he did not care to remember which side had taken more from him. He had lost his share either way, and yet her shiver was real. Snow clung to the edge of her shawl, her boots soaked, her cheeks hollow from hunger. She was no marauder, not here, not now. She was a girl, or a woman barely grown, who had walked too far through the teeth of winter. Jonah gripped the door, caught between instinct and mercy. The silence stretched, broken only by the whine of the wind. He could have turned her away. Many men would have. It would have been easier, safer, cleaner, an answer that required nothing from him but hardness. Instead, with a muttered curse at himself, he stepped back from the threshold. "Come in." Then, she entered without hesitation, her movement steady, though exhaustion weighed her shoulders. Snow scattered from her boots onto the floorboards. Jonah set the bar back against the door, the rifle still close at hand, though his grip on it loosened. She moved straight to the fire, kneeling there as if she had known it would be waiting. Her shawl steamed in the heat, the scent of wet wool mingling with smoke. For a time, neither spoke. Jonah returned to his chair, watching her in the shifting firelight. She sat cross-legged, her hands outstretched to the flame, eyes half-closed with weariness. The long braid down her back gleamed black as coal where the light struck it. Only the sound of her breathing filled the cabin, slow and steady now that the storm was behind her. Jonah studied her, wary as a wolf, but he could not deny the truth of her need. Whatever history lay between their peoples, whatever scars carved across their pasts, she was simply a woman trying not to freeze to death on a winter's night. Jonah leaned back into the rocker. The wood creaked under his weight, filling the silence with its steady rhythm. He realized then how strange it felt. Another heartbeat in the room, another presence besides the echo of his own grief. She did not thank him, not in words. She did not ask for food or drink. She only sat close to the fire, shoulders unwinding as warmth seeped back into her bones. Jonah let her be. Outside, the wind battered at the shutters. Snow piled higher against the walls. Yet inside, for the first time in years, Jonah Hale was not alone with his silence. Two strangers, each carrying loss, now shared a single roof. And though neither would admit it aloud, survival, for this night at least, had begun with that smallest gesture of trust. Morning came pale and gray, light leaking reluctantly through the cabin's frost-lined window. The storm had not relented. Snow still swept across the open range, smoothing earth and fence into a single white sheet. The cold carried its own silence, pressing down on the cabin until even the fire seemed to whisper instead of roar. Jonah rose early, as he always did, his body answering old habits rather than desire. The ranch demanded attention, storm or no storm. He dressed in worn denim and wool, pulled on cracked boots and cinched his coat against the bite of air. When he glanced back toward the hearth, he saw her still there, the stranger who had crossed his threshold. She no longer slept. She sat upright, shawl draped around her shoulders, hands resting in her lap. In the light of day, Jonah saw what night had hidden. Faint scars marked her wrists, not from play or clumsiness, but from binding, hard and deliberate. Her cheek bore the faint trace of an old bruise long healed yet not forgotten. And her eyes, they were not the eyes of a girl. They carried storms older than her years, steady and dark, unwilling to yield. "You got a name?" Jonah asked, voice gravel from sleep and silence. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Nalin," she said. "It means water." The name lingered in the air, soft yet sure, like the whisper of a stream under ice. Jonah gave a curt nod and turned toward the door. There was work waiting. The corral had half collapsed beneath the weight of snow. Jonah set his shoulders to the labor, prying free rails, resetting posts, hammering nails with the dull rhythm of a man too used to solitude. He heard the cabin door creak behind him. When he looked, Nalin stood on the threshold, shawl drawn tight, watching. He expected her to linger only a moment, but she stepped out into the cold and crossed to where he worked. Without a word, she stooped to lift a fallen rail, her small frame bending with effort. Jonah nearly told her to leave it be, but something in her expression, quiet determination, the refusal to be idle, stayed his tongue. Together they set the rail back into place. Through the day, the silence between them shifted. It was no longer the brittle quiet of suspicion, but the heavy hush of two people measuring distance. When Jonah paused to drink from the tin cup on the fence post, she spoke. "My people." Her words were slow, as if each carried a weight. "They are not my people now." I left. Jonah said nothing. He had not asked, but the confession pressed forward as if it had waited too long. There was betrayal. I walked away. Between two fires, I walk alone now. Her eyes flickered toward him, testing whether he understood. He did not answer, but her voice had already reached a place in him that words could not touch. That evening, he worked in the barn, oiling tools, the smell of hay and old wood thick around him. Her voice returned to him with every scrape of cloth on steel, between two fires. He knew something of that ground. He too had walked it, once a man with a family, then a widower with nothing but land to occupy his hands. His wife, buried too young beneath the stony hill. His boy, gone in a single fevered week when the doctor never came. After that, Jonah himself had become a shadow among shadows. When darkness fell, snow began again in earnest. It sifted against the shutters and curled down the chimney's throat. Jonah brought in extra wood, stacking it by the hearth. Nalin sat nearby, mending an old shirt he had long neglected, her stitches precise and sure. The firelight caught the gleam of the needle dancing across her fingers. She worked without question, without seeking thanks. Later, when the wind howled loudest, Jonah found himself sitting in the rocking chair. The motion soothed him, though the creak of it was lonelier than silence itself. His eyes fell on the space beside the hearth where his wife had once kept her weaving basket. Empty now, dust gathering where threads had once lay bright. He shifted, uneasy with memory, but his gaze caught Nalin's instead. She was watching the fire, not him, yet her presence stirred something he had not felt in years, the awareness of another soul alive beneath his roof. The flames painted the cabin in restless shadows. They leapt across the rifle leaning against the wall, across Jonah's boots left by the door, across the rocking chair itself, as if to remind him of all it had once held. The shadows touched Nalin too, climbing the lines of her cheek, glinting in the black river of her braid tied with a strip of faded cloth. For a fleeting moment, Jonah thought of water cutting through stone, soft yet enduring, patient yet unyielding. Neither spoke. Words seemed small against the weight of all they carried. Yet in the hush, something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but the faint recognition of shared exile. He had lost to death what she had lost to betrayal. Both carried scars of abandonment, of homes that no longer held them. Snow thickened against the windows, hemming them in tighter. The fire crackled, throwing sparks like fleeting stars. Jonah leaned back, his chair creaking, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Nalin bent her head, whispering something in her tongue. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a memory. He did not ask. That night, as shadows deepened and the storm closed its hand around the cabin, two lonely souls remained within. They were strangers still, bound by no promise. Yet in the silence of firelight, they shared something deeper than speech, the knowledge that pain is not a solitary burden, and that survival, sometimes, is found not in distance, but in the nearness of another. The blizzard came hard and sudden, rolling down from the high country with a voice like thunder muffled in snow. By afternoon, the land had disappeared under its white hand. Fence posts vanished, the barn blurred, and the canyon itself seemed swallowed whole. The cabin groaned as the wind pressed against it, boards flexing as though the old wood might splinter. Jonah barred the shutters and added another log to the fire. The flames leapt higher, throwing warmth into the single room, though the draft clawed at every crack. He measured flour and beans carefully, setting aside what could be spared. Storms like this had a way of lingering, and a man who lived by himself learned long ago to think ahead. Nalin moved in quiet counterpoint, her hands never idle. She sat near the hearth, mending shirts whose seams had grown loose with years of wear. Her stitches were small, precise, almost ceremonial. The lamplight touched her face, softened by shadows, and glimmered on the needle that rose and fell like the wing of a bird. Jonah found himself watching the rhythm of her hands, the care she gave to work that was not hers to claim. As night deepened, she began to speak. Her voice was low, steady, carrying the cadence of river water slipping over stone. She told stories of stars named long before this land was fenced, of rivers whose courses were marked by song, of children who once listened with wide eyes until sleep overtook them. The words painted worlds Jonah had never seen, yet in the telling, he felt the storm outside lose some of its teeth. He said little, only asked once, "You truly believe the stars carry such names?" Her dark eyes lifted to his, unflinching. Names are what bind us to what is greater. Even when forgotten, they remain. Jonah nodded and let the thought settle. He had no names for stars, only for the cattle buried in storms past and for the graves that lay on the hill. But something in her certainty steadied him. Through the storm, hours stretched long. Jonah tended the fire, then sat in silence, sipping black coffee that steamed in the dim room. Nalin stirred the pot on the stove, the scent of beans filling the air. He watched the way she folded cloth, the way she paused to tuck her braid behind her shoulder, the way she handled each object as if it held worth beyond its weight. It had been years since Jonah had watched anyone move with such quiet grace. He realized, with a pang, how much of living he had allowed to slip into dust. But the storm was not their only visitor. At dusk, when the wind howled fiercest, Nalin stiffened. Her eyes shifted toward the shuttered window. Jonah noticed it too, a sound beneath the storm's roar. Hooves. A single rider moved along the ridge, half swallowed by snow, but the shape was there. Jonah's jaw tightened. Few men rode in weather like this unless driven by need or greed. "Someone hunts," Nalin said softly, her voice certain. Jonah nodded. He had seen the cut of the man's coat, even through the veil of snow. A bounty hunter, or worse, one of the vultures who lived on suspicion and whispered accusation, claiming stolen cattle, stolen goods, or whatever lie gave excuse for violence. Jonah had dealt with their kind before. They thrived in a land where law rode slow. The rider circled once and vanished into the storm. But Jonah knew he had not gone far. Such men had patience when blood or coin might wait behind a door. That night, Jonah pulled his rifle from its place on the wall. He cleaned it by lamplight, cloth rubbing steady along the barrel, oil glistening under the flame. Each movement was practiced, unhurried, but heavy with resolve. Across from him, Nalin braided her hair tight against her head, each weave deliberate as though preparing for judgment. The sight struck Jonah with its quiet power. She was no stranger to the weight of pursuit. She had lived too long with hunters at her back. Neither spoke much. The storm spoke for them, rattling the cabin, sifting snow through cracks in the roof. Yet the silence between them was no longer brittle. It was a silence born of recognition. Each knew what it was to be marked, to be watched, to be hunted by the world in ways both seen and unseen. Jonah laid the rifle across his lap and sat back, listening to the wind test the cabin's bones. Nalin finished her braid and set her shawl around her shoulders. She met his gaze for a long moment, then returned her eyes to the fire. In that fragile light, they were not rancher and intruder, not settler and exile, not even man and woman. They were two souls sealed within the same fragile walls, while danger prowled the edges of the storm. Outside, snow buried the land in silence. Inside, firelight bound them together. And though the storm would pass, they both understood the truth. Safety was never certain, not here, not anywhere. It was as fleeting as sparks drifting up the chimney. But in this night, under this roof, vigilance was shared, and so was the weight of survival. By the fourth morning, the storm relented. Snow no longer fell heavy but drifted light as dust across the pale land. The world outside the cabin lay muted, a hushed expanse where fences lay buried to the rails and the barn door creaked under frost. The silence was not the silence of threat but of aftermath, heavy, absolute, waiting for life to stir again. Inside the cabin, a different silence lingered. Not empty, not brittle as before, but weighted with presence. Jonah rose each day to the same chores, splitting wood, tending stock, clearing snow from paths. Nalin remained within, though not idle. She mended tack with stitches as precise as any blacksmith's hammer. She tended the fire, her shawl trailing like smoke behind her as she moved. Sometimes she hummed under her breath, soft tunes in a tongue Jonah did not know. The sound unsettled him, not because it was harsh, but because it was beautiful in its strangeness. They fell into a rhythm, two separate rivers flowing through the same valley. Their words remained few, a nod at supper, a question answered with a gesture. Yet beneath the civility lay a tautness, as though every moment balanced on the edge of something neither wished to name. One evening, Jonah returned from the barn, snow still clinging to his beard. He stepped into the cabin, stamping ice from his boots, and his eyes fell on her at once. Nalin stood near the hearth, her back partly turned, holding something in her hands. It took him a moment to realize what it was. The shawl. Not the one she always wore, but another. Pale blue wool, frayed at the edges, folded and kept carefully on the shelf above the rocker. His wife's shawl, the last garment she had ever worn before the fever carried her into earth. Jonah's chest tightened. His hands curled hard at his sides. "That's not yours," he said, the words rough as bark. Nalin did not flinch. She did not clutch it or defend herself. Instead, she folded the fabric slowly, with reverence, and laid it back in its place. Her eyes met his, not defiant, not shamed, but steady, as though she had understood what it meant to touch such a thing. "It was beautiful," she said softly. "And loved." Anger surged in Jonah, raw and unfair, rising not from her trespass but from the wound she had pressed without meaning to. The shawl was a relic, a fragile tether to a past he had never allowed another soul to touch. Seeing it in her hands felt like betrayal. Yet even as he bristled, he saw no mockery in her face, no hunger to steal, no insult. Only recognition, the kind of recognition born from someone who had her own relics buried deep in memory. He turned away sharply, forcing his breath steady. The fire popped behind him, sparks leaping. He busied himself at the table, though his hands worked clumsy, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. The air thickened, neither willing to yield ground, both aware of the silence swelling around them. The room felt smaller, the shadows longer. For the first time since she had entered his life, Jonah felt the danger was not from outside, not from bounty hunters or storms, but from within, from the nearness of a woman who reminded him he was still alive. That night, after the meal was cleared and the fire burned low, Jonah sat in his rocker with arms crossed. Nalin knelt near the hearth, her shawl gathered close, lips moving in a language he could not follow. He realized she was praying. Her voice was barely more than breath, yet the cadence carried through the quiet. Jonah half listened, unwilling to intrude, yet he caught the solemnity of it. Her words seemed less like petition and more like remembrance, as though she spoke to ghosts rather than gods. The sound did not strike him as foreign now. Instead, it slipped around him like balm. The raw edge of his anger dulled. The shawl remained where she had placed it, folded as carefully as if his wife's own hands had set it there. Somehow, Jonah felt less alone in that memory than he had in years. Nalin finished her prayer and sat back on her heels, her eyes reflecting firelight. Jonah did not speak, but his gaze lingered. For the first time, her presence no longer felt like intrusion. It felt, though he would not admit it, like shelter. The cabin creaked as the cold settled deeper. Outside, snowfields lay unbroken, pure and harsh. Inside, two lives edged closer not by choice, not yet by trust, but by the slow erosion of distance. Jonah closed his eyes, rocking gently, the rhythm steady as the breath of another soul nearby. He realized with quiet unease that letting someone touch what is sacred meant risking both hurt and healing, and the truth, he could no longer tell which he feared more. The thaw came sudden, as it often did in the high country. One day the snow lay heavy across the land. The next it began to sink into rivulets, water whispering beneath the white. The air held a sharp wetness, and the earth below the drifts stirred restless, as if spring strained at the seams. Jonah felt it in his bones, the uneasy quiet before trouble. He was mending a harness in the yard when he saw them. 3 riders moving slow across the ridge, their figures stark against the pale sky. They circled, not close enough to show their faces, but near enough for Jonah to feel the weight of their eyes. Wolves testing a fence. Nalin stood at the doorway, shawl drawn close. Her gaze hardened the moment she saw the riders. "I know them," she said. Jonah straightened. "You do?" "They traded once with my people. Brought whiskey, rifles, and lies. Men who smiled and cut the throat when backs were turned." Her voice was flat, without fear, only memory. Jonah set the harness aside. His jaw worked as he studied the ridge. He had guessed trouble would come sooner or later. The land was lonely, and lonely land drew scavengers. But knowing they carried a history with Nalin deepened the danger. That evening, the riders did not return. The horizon lay still, though Jonah sensed their presence, waiting. He cleaned his rifle by lamplight, oiling the barrel until it gleamed. Across from him, Nalin sat cross-legged on the floor, mending a strap with quick, certain hands. When she finished, she laid the leather aside and looked at him directly. "If you fight," she said, her voice low but firm, "I will stand beside you." Jonah lifted his eyes from the rifle. For a long breath, he studied her face, the steady dark of her gaze, the braid that trailed over her shoulder, the quiet strength etched in every line. He saw not the shivering stranger who had knocked on his door, but a woman marked by betrayal, by survival, by a fire that had not gone out despite the storm she had walked through. "Why?" he asked. "Because I have no other home," she said simply, "and because you do not fight only for land. You fight for what is left of yourself." Jonah set the rifle down across his knees. He felt the truth of her words sink deep. He had spent years defending little more than soil and silence. But now, with her under his roof, he felt the fight shift into something greater. The defense of dignity, of shared survival, perhaps even of a fragile promise he dared not name. The fire snapped, sparks scattering upward. For the first time, Jonah looked at her not as an intruder, not even as a guest, but as an equal, scarred, abandoned, unbroken. At dawn, the hunters came. The first shot cracked across the still air, shattering the white silence. Jonah answered from the porch, his rifle steady as stone. The echo thundered down the valley. The riders spurred closer, one firing wild, another circling toward the barn. Snow flew beneath their horses' hooves. Nalin was already there, her shawl trailing as she moved. She took her place beside Jonah with a rifle she had lifted from the wall, her stance sure, her face unflinching. She fired once, the shot whistling true, and one rider veered, clutching his arm. The fight unfolded swift and fierce. Jonah moved with the steadiness of a man who had long known violence. His shots measured, not wasted. Nalin was quicker, her aim sharp, her body shifting like shadow behind the porch rail. Bullets split wood, snow kicked into the air, horses screamed. One rider fell. Another retreated, blood marking his trail across the snow. The last wheeled his horse wide, cursing, but Jonah's second shot caught him across the shoulder. The man cried out and fled, leaving the land scattered with blood and hoofprints. Silence fell as sudden as the shots had begun. The snow was torn, the cabin walls scarred with holes, but the roof still stood. Jonah lowered his rifle, breath steaming in the cold air. Nalin lowered hers as well. For a long moment they stood side by side, the echo of gunfire still ringing in their ears, the sharp smell of powder drifting between them. Her braid had come loose, strands whipping in the wind, her shawl darkened by snow. Yet she stood steady, unbroken. Jonah turned to her. Their eyes met, and in that quiet exchange lay the truth. They had not just fought together, but survived together. The bond between them was no longer silence, no longer suspicion. It had been sealed in fire and blood. She spoke first, her voice low. "They will not return soon." "No," Jonah agreed. He set the rifle against the wall and drew a long breath. His hands shook faintly, not from fear, but from the weight of what had passed. He looked at her then, with something he had not allowed himself in years, reverence, and something dangerously near to love. The snow gleamed red where the hunters had fallen. The wind carried the last echo of hoofbeats away. And beneath the battered roof of the Hale Ranch, 2 lives stood changed. Love may have sparked in firelight, Jonah realized, but it proved itself here, in battle, shoulder to shoulder, with nothing left between them but trust. The land lay hushed after the storm of rifles. Snow stretched white and wounded, streaked with crimson trails where the hunters had fled or fallen. The ranch bore its own scars, splintered wood along the porch, holes punched in the siding, a window cracked clean through. Smoke curled from the chimney as though nothing had changed, yet everything had. Jonah sat in his old rocking chair, its creak steady as a heart still beating. The rifle lay across his lap, barrel cooling, stock polished by years of use. His hands, scarred and calloused, rested on the weapon without urgency, as though it had grown into an extension of himself. He looked out over the valley, where the thaw had begun its slow work. Snow softened at the edges, rivulets carving narrow paths down into the sage and stone. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Nalin stepped into the pale light. Her braid hung loose now, strands tumbling free about her shoulders. The shawl wrapped around her bore the marks of powder and snow, but her face was calm. She paused at the threshold, studying him as though weighing something deeper than words. "They are gone," she said. Jonah nodded. "For now." She looked past him, to the horizon. "Others may come." "They always do." The rocker creaked beneath Jonah's weight. "Aye," he said, "but we'll be ready." Silence fell again, broken only by the soft drip of meltwater from the eaves. Nalin drew the shawl tighter, her gaze turning inward. "Perhaps it is time I go," she said at last, voice measured, steady. "The road is long, but it is the only life I have known." Jonah did not look at her. He traced the grain of the rifle stock with his thumb, as though considering not the weapon, but the years that had carried him to this moment. Then he spoke, slow and without flourish. "Stay," he said. "If you wish it." The words hung between them, plain as iron, soft as spring rain. Not command, not plea, only the offer of ground after years of drifting. Nalin's breath caught faintly. She turned toward him, studying the profile of his face, weathered, scarred, grayed by grief, yet lit now with a quiet steadiness. She had wandered long enough to know the difference between false shelter and true. What he offered was neither charity nor cage. It was choice. For a long time she said nothing. The wind moved through the bare branches. The valley waited, then she stepped back inside. Jonah followed with his eyes, but did not rise. The rocker groaned beneath him as he listened to the soft sounds within. The rustle of cloth, the clink of her small pouch set upon the table, the faint sigh of the fire as it was stoked. When she returned to the doorway, her pouch no longer hung at her side. She had left it on the table, as if roots had taken where once there had been only dust. She came to sit across from him by the fire. No words passed between them, yet something heavier than speech settled. The end of wandering, the beginning of belonging. That night the cabin was quiet save for the crackle of wood, the steady breath of two souls who had long carried exile. Jonah sat with his coffee cooling in his hand, watching the firelight flicker across her face. Nalin bent her head over her braid, fingers weaving it anew, deliberate and sure. He saw in that braid not just beauty, but a symbol, the binding together of strands once loose, now held fast. When sleep took them, it was deep and untroubled. By morning, the snow had begun to yield in earnest. Water ran beneath the drifts, trickling toward the river. The air smelled faintly of thaw and pine. Jonah saddled his horse, not for flight, but for a ride into town. Supplies would be needed. Word would have spread of the skirmish. Nalin joined him, her shawl drawn close, eyes steady. They rode together down the winding trail, Silence their companion. The land was scarred, yet alive, just as they were. At the valley's edge, Jonah reined in his horse. He looked across the wide stretch of country, the same land he had once thought to die upon in solitude. Now, with her beside him, it seemed different. Not lighter, not easier, but shared. Nalin turned her face toward him, her expression unreadable, yet full of quiet strength. She did not speak, nor did she need to. The choice had already been made, as plain as the tracks of two horses in melting snow. They rode on. The reckoning had passed. What lay ahead was not promised, not without hardship, but it was theirs. And in the hush of that morning, with water running toward spring, Jonah Hale knew that for the first time in years, he was not alone.